At 10:45 p.m., the lights were still on inside a quiet British intelligence building that was supposed to be empty by then. The war in Western Europe was already tilting toward an inevitable conclusion, yet a thin folder was being stamped with a classification that made no sense. Not top secret, not operational, absolute restriction, sealed for decades. The reason was not a weapon, not a plan, not a list of agents. It was a question. One sentence, and the order attached to it was blunt. It was never to be written down again. Outside, the war still breathed heavily. Artillery echoed across a continent that had been burning for almost 6 years. Rail lines were shattered. Cities were dimmed to shadows. Millions of men were moving east and west across ruined roads, following orders that had already outlived their original logic. Victory was visible now, but it was not clean. It was not fast. And it was not behaving the way Allied doctrine said it should. By early 1945, the material imbalance was overwhelming. Allied forces controlled the skies. Fuel flowed where it was needed, suggests. Replacement units arrived faster than casualties could empty the ranks. On paper, the conflict was entering its final chapter. Yet reports arriving every morning told a different story. German units that should have collapsed were still fighting. Retreats were executed with discipline. Counterattacks erupted in places marked as secure only hours earlier. Intelligence summaries grew thicker, not clearer. This was the pressure hanging over every command table in London. The war was being won, but not understood. And for a small number of senior commanders, that gap mattered more than maps or tonnage. Because misunderstanding an enemy at the moment of victory was how wars extended themselves. It was how casualties multiplied after the outcome was already decided. One man noticed this before most others, not through speeches or strategy papers, but through unease. He studied daily situation maps not as proof of progress, but as evidence of friction. Lines moved forward, yes, but they bent in strange ways. German resistance did not always align with terrain or supply logic. Some formations disintegrated instantly. Others held far longer than reason allowed. During briefings, he did not interrupt. He did not argue doctrine. He waited until the room emptied and the noise faded. Then he asked staff officers to bring him raw reports instead of summaries. Interrogation notes, field impressions, half-finished intelligence cables. The pieces that never made it into official conclusions. What he saw disturbed him. German decisions in the final months of the war were not driven purely by command orders or material calculation. Something else was operating beneath the surface, something not taught in staff colleges, something that could not be plotted on a map. The system around him was not built to chase that kind of uncertainty. Allied intelligence doctrine favored measurable factors, numbers of divisions, fuel consumption rates, rail capacity, air superiority ratios. These were the pillars of modern warfare. They had worked, they were working, and questioning them too closely was considered unnecessary, at best destabilizing at worst. Yet the war kept producing moments that refused to fit. Units fought to destruction in areas with no strategic value. Others withdrew calmly from positions that doctrine said should be defended at all costs. Prisoners spoke with exhaustion, not confusion. Defeat was not shocking them. It was confirming something they had already accepted. At first, these contradictions were dismissed as anomalies. Stress, fanaticism, disorganization, convenient explanations that preserved the comfort of existing models. But the anomalies did not fade. They accumulated. And the closer the war came to its end, the stranger the pattern became. It was during this period that a captured German general was brought in for questioning. Not for tactical extraction. Not for immediate operational gain. The front lines were already moving faster than any information he could provide. This meeting served a different purpose, one that was never placed on the official agenda. The room was quiet. No dramatics, no raised voices. The man across the table was defeated but not broken. His uniform no longer carried authority, yet his posture still reflected habit. He answered expected questions without resistance. Unit locations, timelines, communications breakdowns. All routine, all predictable. Then the questioning shifted. The Allied officers present expected another logistical probe, another attempt to confirm intelligence already gathered. Instead, the senior commander paused. He looked at the prisoner not as a source, but as a mind that had lived inside the war from the opposite direction. And he asked something no transcript would ever record. The effect was immediate. The German general did not respond. He did not deflect. He did not object. He stopped. For several seconds, the room held its breath. Not because of fear, but because of recognition. The question had bypassed doctrine entirely. It did not ask how the war was fought. It asked why it was still being fought at all. What followed was not a confession. It was not remorse. It was an explanation that clashed violently with Allied assumptions. An explanation that suggested the final months of the war were not governed by collapse, but by a different internal logic altogether. That answer never entered an official report. Within hours, notes were removed. Summaries were altered. The meeting was reduced to a footnote. And deep inside British intelligence, a decision was made that would outlive the war itself. Some questions, it was decided, were more dangerous than enemy weapons. By the time dawn approached and the building finally went dark, the folder was gone. Not destroyed, sealed, locked away for half a century. And the war rolled on, still moving toward victory, carrying with it a misunderstanding that would shape how it was remembered. Because if that question were ever revisited, it would force a different conclusion. One that suggested the war did not end simply because one side ran out of resources. It ended because one side finally ran out of reasons. And that realization was still waiting to surface. By 7:30 a.m., the war rooms were already awake. Maps were unrolled. Markers moved forward by inches that represented miles. Briefings followed a rhythm refined over years of fighting. This was how victory was processed, step by step, methodical, measurable, safe. On paper, everything was working. Allied doctrine at this stage of the war rested on a simple belief. Industrial superiority decided outcomes. If one side controlled the air, the fuel, the factories, and the supply routes, resistance would collapse on a predictable curve. This belief had been proven again and again. In North Africa, in Italy, in the skies over Germany. It was the logic that justified every loss and promised every gain. More pressure meant less resistance. Less resistance meant faster victory. Yet the reports arriving from the field refused to behave. German formations that should have disintegrated under bombardment were retreating in ordered blocks. Supply columns that should have been paralyzed were still moving at night. Command structures that should have collapsed under attrition were continuing to function even when isolated. These were not the actions of an army simply running out of material. They were the actions of an army operating under a different internal calculus. The intelligence system was not designed to measure that. British and American intelligence processes had evolved to serve a specific kind of war, one where production tonnage and logistics determined success. Analysts were trained to quantify, to reduce human behavior into patterns that could be graphed, predicted, and countered. Morale was measured indirectly. Psychology was considered secondary. Culture was an afterthought. These variables were acknowledged but never allowed to challenge the foundation. This worked well against an enemy that fought for advantage. It struggled against an enemy that fought for meaning. Inside the system, questioning this distinction was risky. Doctrine was not just theory. It was institutional memory. It was how promotions were earned and budgets justified. It was how losses were explained to governments and populations already exhausted by years of war. To suggest that the enemy's endurance was not irrational but internally coherent threatened more than analysis. It threatened narrative, and narrative mattered. Allied leadership needed the war to make sense, not only strategically but morally. The enemy had to be collapsing because it was wrong, outdated, and inferior. Victory had to be inevitable, not negotiated by understanding the opponent's worldview. Anything else blurred the line between winner and loser in uncomfortable ways. This was the tension now tightening beneath the surface. The senior commander who had asked the forbidden question understood this instinctively. He had spent years navigating between political leaders, military planners, and field commanders. He knew which truths were welcomed and which were quietly buried. He also knew that wars were often prolonged not by lack of power, but by refusal to adapt one's understanding of the enemy. What unsettled him most was not what the German general had said. It was how well it explained recent events. The explanation reframed resistance not as desperation, but as coherence. German units were not fighting to win anymore. They were fighting to complete something, to preserve internal order, to delay collapse in a way that maintained identity. In that framework, sacrifice was not irrational, it was logical. This perspective did not appear in intelligence manuals. If accepted, it would mean that Allied pressure alone was insufficient to end the war quickly. It would mean that even total material dominance could still allow prolonged resistance as long as the enemy's internal narrative remained intact. It suggested that the war's final phase would be decided not only by force, but by psychological rupture. That conclusion had consequences. To act on it would require altering interrogation methods, information campaigns, and even operational tempo. It would require acknowledging that enemy behavior was not random, but purposeful, in a way Allied doctrine did not fully account for. And it would require senior leadership to accept that some of their assumptions about inevitability were incomplete. The system resisted this. When intelligence summaries moved upward, they were filtered. Language softened. Implications narrowed. The explanation was reduced to familiar terms: fanaticism, command breakdown, isolated anomalies. Each label preserved the integrity of existing models, while quietly ignoring the pattern forming underneath. This was not a conspiracy. It was institutional gravity. Organizations at war gravitate toward interpretations that justify their structure. Anything else creates friction at the exact moment when clarity is demanded. The war had reached a point where leadership wanted confirmation, not complication. Yet the complication refused to disappear. Field reports continued to describe enemy behavior that contradicted expectations. Prisoners spoke less about defeat and more about obligation. Units surrendered only when internal cohesion failed, not when supplies ran out. The moment of collapse was psychological, not logistical. The senior commander began to understand the danger, not of the enemy, but of misunderstanding the enemy at the moment of final decision. If Allied leadership believed resistance would collapse automatically, they would continue applying pressure uniformly. If resistance instead required a different kind of disruption, uniform pressure might prolong the fighting rather than shorten it. Lives would be lost not because victory was unattainable, but because it was being pursued with incomplete understanding. He raised the issue carefully, not in grand briefings, not in written memos. He asked questions in side conversations. He suggested alternative interpretations without naming their source. Each time the response was polite and dismissive. The system heard what it could absorb and rejected the rest. There was no place for this insight to land, and so a decision was made not formally but effectively. The question would remain unexamined. The explanation would remain unofficial. The war would be allowed to end according to established expectations, even if that meant accepting unnecessary cost. Sealing the question was not about hiding truth. It was about preserving coherence. If the war ended without acknowledging this dimension, history would remember victory as the product of superiority alone. Doctrine would remain intact. Institutions would remain validated. Future conflicts would be planned with the same assumptions. The alternative was too disruptive. As the days passed, the front lines continued to move. Towns fell. Bridges were taken intact or destroyed on schedule. Casualty figures rose and fell within predicted ranges. From a distance, everything appeared under control. But beneath the surface, one realization lingered. The war was approaching its conclusion without being fully understood. And the longer that understanding was delayed, the more dangerous the final phase could become. Because if the enemy was not fighting for survival but for completion, then the moment of collapse would not come from pressure alone. It would come from something breaking inside. The question now was whether Allied leadership would recognize that break when it appeared or mistake it for another anomaly. The answer to that would decide how the war truly ended. The days that followed did not bring revelation. They brought momentum. Orders moved down the chain. Timetables tightened. Pressure increased everywhere at once. From the outside, the campaign appeared to be accelerating exactly as planned. Inside headquarters, however, something subtle had changed. Intelligence officers continued to brief commanders using familiar language, but the confidence behind it had thinned. Predictions were still delivered, yet they were increasingly hedged. Phrases like expected collapse and final resistance began to share space with less comfortable terms. Unpredictable, inconsistent, anomalous. No one challenged the framework openly, but fewer people trusted it fully. The sealed question had created a fault line. German command behavior in the early months of 1945 began to fracture in ways that could not be explained by material shortage alone. Some units fought with extreme cohesion until the very last moment, then dissolved almost overnight. Others disintegrated early despite having supplies and orders intact. The timing of collapse varied wildly from one sector to another, even under similar conditions. To Allied planners, this was frustrating. Uniform pressure was supposed to produce uniform results. Instead, it produced uneven outcomes that complicated operational tempo. Advances stalled unexpectedly. Pockets of resistance flared where none were anticipated. Casualty projections drifted upward, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. The senior commander who had asked the forbidden question recognized the pattern immediately. What he saw unfolding matched the explanation he had been given in that quiet room weeks earlier. The enemy was not responding to force as a single organism. It was responding according to internal thresholds that varied by formation, by leadership, by shared belief. Those thresholds were invisible to Allied doctrine. In some German units, loyalty to command structure held longer than loyalty to survival. In others, belief in purpose outlasted fear of defeat. When those beliefs finally collapsed, the breakdown was sudden and total. There was no gradual erosion. One day, a unit resisted fiercely. The next day, it ceased to exist as a fighting force. This kind of collapse could not be predicted by counting tanks or measuring fuel. It required understanding the moment when meaning failed. Attempts to integrate this insight quietly began. Interrogation teams adjusted their questioning, probing motivation rather than disposition. Psychological warfare units experimented with messaging that targeted identity rather than threat. Some field commanders instinctively altered their approach, bypassing strong points that felt brittle and concentrating pressure. Where resistance seemed ideologically rigid, results were inconsistent, sometimes effective, sometimes not. Without a shared framework, these efforts lacked coordination. Each success appeared isolated. Each failure reinforced skepticism. The system still resisted formal acknowledgement. At higher levels, leadership remained focused on the schedule. Political pressure was mounting. Populations expected closure. Governments wanted the war concluded decisively, not explained philosophically. Any suggestion that victory required deeper engagement with the enemy's internal logic sounded like delay, and delay was unacceptable. This created a paradox. The closer victory came, the less tolerance there was for complexity. The war needed to end cleanly. Clean endings require simple explanations. The sealed question threatened that simplicity. If it were acknowledged, it would imply that the war's duration and cost were shaped not only by enemy strength, but by Allied assumptions. That some suffering might have been avoidable. That understanding the enemy earlier could have shortened the conflict. These were not conclusions institutions welcome, especially at the moment of triumph. So the question remained sealed. Not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. Meanwhile, the battlefield began to reflect the truth anyway. German command cohesion deteriorated unevenly. Some senior officers began acting independently, prioritizing preservation of their units over obedience to collapsing authority. Others clung rigidly to directives that no longer served strategic purpose. The absence of a unifying internal narrative accelerated fragmentation. This was the break the explanation had predicted. As meaning eroded, so did coordination. Communications failures multiplied. Orders contradicted each other. In some areas, resistance ended without formal surrender. In others, fighting continued long after it served any military logic. Allied forces advanced faster, where psychological collapse preceded material collapse. Where it did not progress, slowed. These patterns were noted quietly, filed away, never connected publicly. The senior commander watched this unfold with a mixture of confirmation and frustration. The insight he had been given was proving accurate in real time, yet there was no mechanism to elevate it. The war machine was already in motion, committed to a conclusion shaped by its original assumptions. He understood then that the question had arrived too late. Not too late to matter, but too late to change doctrine. Wars teach lessons unevenly. Some lessons reshape institutions. Others are buried beneath victory narratives. This one fell into the latter category. It explained the end of the war, but it did not fit the story leaders wanted to tell afterward. As German resistance finally collapsed across most fronts, the explanation lost urgency. Victory washed over uncertainty. The need to ask why faded as the fact of success dominated memory. Yet the cost lingered. Thousands of lives had been lost in the final months of fighting, often in engagements that occurred after the outcome was effectively decided. These battles would later be described as necessary, inevitable, unavoidable. Few would question whether a different understanding might have shortened them. The sealed question held that possibility. By the time Berlin fell and the war in Europe ended, the decision to keep that question hidden had solidified into policy. Documents were classified. References were removed. The interrogation became a ghost in the archives known only to those who had been present. History moved on, but beneath the surface of the victory narrative, a quiet truth remained. The war had ended not simply because one side ran out of resources, but because an internal logic collapsed faster than Allied planners expected. That collapse had a structure, it had a timing, and it could have been understood sooner. The refusal to acknowledge that understanding shaped how the war would be remembered, taught, and repeated, and it set the stage for a future where the same question might be asked again under different circumstances with the same hesitation. The war ended loudly, but its explanations settled quietly. By late 1945, Europe was no longer a battlefield. It was an aftermath. Cities were ruins, borders were fluid, governments reassembled themselves from fragments, and inside intelligence agencies, attention shifted with remarkable speed. Yesterday's enemy became today's subject of study, not to understand how the war had been fought, but to predict the next one. This transition was not gradual. It was immediate. Files were reorganized. Departments were renamed. Analysts who had spent years studying German operations were reassigned to new threats. The Soviet Union moved from ally to variable to concern in a matter of months. The urgency of victory gave way to the urgency of preparation. In this shift, the sealed question did not disappear. It was absorbed. The insight it contained, stripped of its origin and its context, was quietly repurposed. Intelligence culture did not adopt it openly. Instead, it reframed it in safer terms. Psychological factors, ideological cohesion, command-belief structures, concepts discussed abstractly without reference to the moment that had revealed their power. Doctrine evolved but cautiously. Early Cold War planning emphasized deterrence and material balance, yet unease lingered beneath the surface. Western intelligence agencies now faced an opponent that could not be understood through conventional metrics alone. The Soviet system did not operate on market logic. Its military behavior could not be predicted solely by supply constraints. Once again, the enemy's internal narrative mattered. This time, analysts were more careful. Interrogation techniques changed. Greater attention was paid to belief, not just capability. Propaganda analysis expanded beyond messaging to meaning. Psychological warfare became a formal discipline rather than an improvisation. These developments were presented as innovations born from new challenges. Few acknowledged that they were refinements of a lesson learned earlier and buried. The commander who had asked the forbidden question watched this evolution from a distance. He did not campaign for recognition. He did not publish a defense. He understood institutions well enough to know how memory worked. Wars reward those who align with narrative. They forget those who complicate it. In private correspondence, however, his frustration surfaced, not as anger, but as concern. He worried that by avoiding the full implications of what had been learned, future conflicts would repeat the same pattern. Over-reliance on material superiority, underestimation of ideological endurance, surprise when resistance persisted beyond rational expectation. History, he suspected, was not done teaching this lesson. For decades, the classified material remained untouched, not because it was guarded constantly, but because no one was looking for it. Archives are vast. Silence does not require effort. It requires disinterest. As long as the war's official story satisfied public understanding, there was no pressure to revisit uncomfortable corners. Meanwhile, the narrative hardened. World War II came to be remembered as a triumph of production coordination and inevitable momentum. The enemy was overwhelmed. The system worked. Victory validated doctrine. This story served political stability and institutional confidence. It shaped how new officers were trained and how new conflicts were approached. Complexity was trimmed away. Then time did what it always does. Witnesses died. Urgency faded. Classification clocks ran out. By the time the 50-year mark approached, the world had changed again. The Cold War had ended. Another superpower had collapsed not from invasion, but from internal erosion. Analysts began asking different questions. Why systems endure longer than expected? Why collapse often arrives suddenly? Why material strength does not guarantee coherence? These questions led some historians back into the archives. What they found was not a revelation, but a confirmation. Notes that hinted at an alternative interpretation of the war's end. Fragments of interrogation summaries that stopped abruptly. References to a conversation that was never fully transcribed. The absence itself became meaningful. The question, when reconstructed, no longer threatened institutions. Too much time had passed. It now threatened certainty. It suggested that victory had been achieved alongside misunderstanding. That Allied success did not equate to full comprehension. That the war's final phase had followed a psychological arc as much as a military one. And that acknowledging this did not diminish victory, but complicated it. Complication is uncomfortable, yet for those willing to look, the sealed question offered a different way of reading history. Not as a sequence of inevitable outcomes, but as a series of decisions shaped by what leaders chose to understand or ignore. It reframed the end of the war as a moment when insight arrived late, acted quietly, and was then set aside. The realization carried forward. Modern conflicts studied through this lens began to look familiar. Prolonged resistance, sudden collapse, enemies who did not behave according to expected models. Once again, analysts debated whether force alone was sufficient, or whether meaning determined endurance. The question, once sealed, had returned without ceremony, and with it came an unsettling implication. If the end of the greatest war of the 20th century had been misunderstood at the moment of victory, Then certainty in any conflict was more fragile than doctrine admitted. The war had ended. The lesson had waited. And history, patient as always, had preserved it for those willing to listen. The cost of suppression did not announce itself immediately. It accumulated quietly, embedded in habits, assumptions, and training manuals that carried the weight of unquestioned success. In the years after the war, Western military culture absorbed a powerful lesson, but only partially. Material superiority worked. Coordination worked. Industrial scale decided outcomes. These conclusions were not wrong. They were simply incomplete. And incompleteness, when mistaken for certainty, becomes dangerous over time. Young officers were taught how the war was won, not how it nearly lingered. Case studies focused on logistics, production curves, air superiority, and combined arms doctrine. Psychological endurance was discussed, but as a modifier, not a driver. Meaning was treated as an accessory to force, not a force in itself. This shaped instincts. When later conflicts resisted prediction, the response was familiar. Increase pressure, expand commitment, apply force more evenly. The assumption was always the same. If resistance persisted, it meant the application had been insufficient. Rarely did planners pause to ask whether the resistance was operating under a logic they were not measuring. The sealed question had warned against this reflex, but warnings that challenge institutional identity rarely survive victory. They are filed away as anomalies not integrated as principles. Over time, the absence of that principle became visible not in theory, but in repetition. In conflict after conflict, technologically superior forces found themselves surprised by endurance. Not because the enemy was stronger, but because the enemy's internal narrative had not yet collapsed. In those moments, planners returned to the same tools that had worked before, expecting the same curve toward inevitability. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. What was missing was not power, but timing. The understanding of when pressure breaks cohesion and when it merely hardens it. The difference between acceleration and extension. The sealed question had pointed directly at that distinction. The commander who had first recognized this did not live to see how often it would be missed. But the pattern he had sensed continued. Wars ended, but often later than expected. Costs rose at the margins. Victories arrived with confusion attached. Analysts explained these outcomes as complexity culture or unpredictability, rarely as blind spots. Blind spots are uncomfortable to name because they imply responsibility. By the late 20th century, a new generation of strategists began circling the same idea from a different direction: systems theory, collapse dynamics, organizational psychology. These fields described how complex systems do not fail gradually, but suddenly once internal coherence gives way. Material stress alone does not cause collapse. Loss of meaning does. The language was new. The insight was not. What had been observed in the final months of the Second World War appeared again reframed. Resistance persists while internal logic holds. Collapse arrives when belief fractures. Force can accelerate that fracture, but only if applied with understanding. Without it, force often delays the end by strengthening identity against pressure. This realization forced a quiet reckoning. If wars are shaped by internal thresholds rather than external totals, then planning based solely on accumulation is flawed. If collapse is psychological before it is logistical, then victory requires more than dominance. It requires timing, perception, and restraint. These ideas were debated cautiously. No one wanted to undermine the legacy of the war that had defined modern order. But beneath the respect for that legacy, uncertainty grew. Had the war truly ended when it did because of superior application of force, or had it ended because something inside the enemy finally gave way independently of the last operations conducted against it? The sealed question suggested the latter. Accepting that would not diminish the achievement of victory. It would reframe it. It would suggest that success was achieved not by overwhelming every variable, but by coinciding, perhaps accidentally, with the moment when the enemy's internal logic collapsed. Accidental alignment is not how institutions prefer to remember triumph. So the story remained unchanged. Yet the cost of that choice lingered. Not in history books, but in expectations. Future wars were approached with confidence that pressure alone would suffice. When it did not, confusion followed. Analysts searched for missing capabilities instead of missing understanding. The result was often prolonged conflict at the margins where victory was already certain, but not yet realized. The most dangerous phase. The phase where casualties continue after outcomes are decided. That phase had been visible in 1945. It had been explained, and it had been set aside. What makes this cost enduring is not that the lesson was forgotten. It is that it was remembered without attribution diluted into safe abstractions. Psychological factors were acknowledged but never elevated. Doctrine evolved, but cautiously, always careful not to suggest that previous certainty had been incomplete. Certainty is a powerful inheritance. It shapes how institutions teach, plan, and justify action. To question it retroactively feels like betrayal, even when evidence demands it. The sealed question was not a critique of victory. It was a critique of how victory was understood. And that distinction matters, because understanding does not change the past. It changes what is repeated. By the time the archives reopened and historians reconstructed fragments of that interrogation, the opportunity to adjust the narrative had passed. The war had become a symbol, not a case study. Symbols resist nuance. They require clarity, not ambiguity. Yet the ambiguity remained quietly influencing those willing to see it. The question had never been about Germany alone. It was about war itself, about how conflicts end, about why some end suddenly, while others drag on long after logic says they should be finished. The answer, once glimpsed, suggested that endings are less about exhaustion than about resolution. Less about force than about fracture, less about victory than about when belief finally breaks. That idea was too powerful to be ignored forever. It waited, moving from archive to theory, from theory to practice resurfacing, whenever a conflict defied expectation. Each time it did, it carried the same implication. That the most decisive moments in war are often invisible at the time they occur, and that the most dangerous thing a system can do is mistake momentum for understanding. The decision to seal the question did not happen in a single room or with a single signature. It unfolded the way institutional decisions often do, quietly, incrementally, with no one person fully responsible, and no one willing to reverse it once momentum set in. It began as caution. In the days following the interrogation, summaries were circulated in draft form. They were short, clinical, focused on what could be safely extracted. Names were omitted. Interpretations softened. Where the explanation edged toward motive or belief language, shifted back to structure and command failure. What could not be translated into established terminology was left out. No one objected openly. The reasoning was sound, at least on the surface. The war was still active. Loose interpretations could confuse planning. Psychological speculation, if mishandled, could mislead commanders already under pressure. Better to wait, better to preserve clarity, better to avoid conclusions that could not be operationalized immediately. So the material was set aside temporarily. Temporary decisions have a way of becoming permanent. As victory drew closer, the appetite for revision disappeared entirely. Senior leadership wanted closure, not reinterpretation. The final phase of the war demanded decisiveness, not introspection. There was no space for insights that complicated the narrative of steady progress toward inevitable success. The question did exactly that. It suggested that the war's end was not simply the result of accumulated pressure, but of a specific internal collapse that had its own timing and logic. That implication raised an uncomfortable possibility that some of the final fighting may not have been necessary. That force had continued after meaning had already begun to fail. Such ideas do not land well in wartime command structures. They threaten morale. They invite doubt. They open space for second-guessing at the precise moment unity is required. From an institutional perspective, sealing the question was not suppression, it was stabilization. That is how it was justified. Internal memoranda framed the decision as a matter of focus. Intelligence resources were to be redirected toward immediate post-war concerns. The interrogation, while interesting, offered limited tactical value going forward. Its broader implications were noted, but deferred. Classification ensured the material would remain available for future study without disrupting current operations. This language mattered. By framing the decision as preservation rather than concealment, responsibility dissolved. No one was hiding truth. They were safeguarding it for a more appropriate time. That time, however, was never clearly defined. Once the war ended, the logic hardened. Victory demanded a clean story. Nations emerging from total war needed certainty. They needed to believe that sacrifice had followed a rational arc toward a decisive outcome. Introducing ambiguity at that moment risked undermining public trust and institutional legitimacy. The question, if revealed, would invite exactly that ambiguity. It would ask why resistance lasted as long as it did, why some battles occurred after strategic defeat was unavoidable, why collapse came unevenly, and why it came suddenly rather than gradually. These questions would not weaken victory, but they would complicate it. Complication was unwelcome, and so classification became policy, access restricted, references removed. The interrogation was no longer something to be interpreted. It became something to be stored. The commander who had asked the question understood this logic even as he disagreed with it. He recognized the trade-off being made: clarity for coherence, understanding for stability. In the short term, the choice made sense. In the long term, he suspected it would carry a cost. But institutions are not built to optimize for long-term introspection. They are built to function. The sealing of the question was not an act of fear. It was an act of confidence. Confidence that the system already understood the war well enough. Confidence that further insight was unnecessary. Confidence that victory validated the framework that produced it. That confidence would shape everything that followed. As files were locked away and attention shifted to new threats the moment passed, the question faded from memory, surviving only as an absence in the record. No scandal, no controversy, Just a quiet omission that no one outside a narrow circle ever noticed. History absorbed the war whole without that missing piece. Yet, the absence mattered. It shaped how victory was taught, how doctrine was written, and how future conflicts were imagined. The system moved forward, carrying a simplified understanding of how wars end, reinforced by the greatest success of its history. The sealed question remained where it had been placed. Not buried deep, but placed just far enough out of reach to be forgotten, until decades later someone would notice the gap. Not because they were looking for it, but because the patterns of new wars began to echo the final months of the old one. Endurance beyond expectation. Collapse without warning. Victories delayed by misunderstanding. Only then would the logic behind that long-ago decision begin to unravel. Because the question had never been dangerous on its own. What was dangerous was what it implied. Decades later, the question resurfaced without ceremony. There was no announcement, no press release, no dramatic unsealing. It emerged the way inconvenient truths often do, through the margins of unrelated research. A historian tracing interrogation procedures noticed an irregularity, a reference that stopped mid-sentence, a meeting logged without a corresponding transcript, a classification code that did not match its contents. At first, it looked like clerical error, but patterns formed. The absence repeated itself across files that should have overlapped. Where summaries should have converged, they diverged. Where analysis should have deepened, it abruptly ended. The war, so meticulously documented, contained a small but deliberate silence. That silence pointed backward. When the material was finally reconstructed, not fully but sufficiently, it no longer shocked. Too much time had passed. Too many other conflicts had followed similar arcs. What it did instead was confirm something historians had already begun to suspect. That the end of the war in Europe was not simply the final exhaustion of an enemy, but the collapse of an internal logic that had held longer than expected. The question once feared now read as obvious. It asked about purpose, not capability, about obligation, not orders, about why an army continued to fight when winning was no longer possible. The answer, inferred from fragments and corroborated by later evidence, revealed a truth that had been uncomfortable in 1945 and almost banal now. Wars end when belief ends, not belief in victory, but belief in continuation. As long as a system can explain to itself why it still exists, it will endure pressure that appears irrational from the outside. When that explanation fails, collapse arrives suddenly, often without warning. This was what Allied planners had witnessed without fully understanding it. The German war effort had not disintegrated evenly, because its internal logic had not failed evenly. Some formations lost meaning early. Others clung to it until the very end. The moment of collapse varied not by supply levels, but by the durability of belief within each command structure. This understanding reframed the final months of the war. Battles once described as stubborn resistance appeared instead as expressions of coherence. Surrenders once labeled inexplicable became predictable. The uneven tempo of collapse made sense when viewed through the lens of internal thresholds rather than external pressure. None of this diminished Allied achievement. It clarified it. Victory had coincided with collapse. Not because pressure alone caused it, but because pressure eventually aligned with the moment belief could no longer be sustained. That alignment was not guaranteed. It was contingent. It could have taken longer. It could have cost more. The sealed question had recognized that contingency. What changed with time was not the validity of the insight, but the willingness to accept its implications. In the aftermath of later conflicts, analysts became more open to discussing psychological rupture as a decisive factor. Collapse dynamics entered strategic vocabulary. The idea that war's end suddenly not gradually gained acceptance. Yet even then, the temptation remained to treat these ideas as supplementary rather than central. The legacy of the sealed question was not that it introduced a new truth. It was that it revealed how resistant institutions are to truths that arrive at the wrong moment. Victory demands affirmation. It rarely welcomes complication. Looking back, the decision to seal the question appears neither malicious nor foolish. It was human. Leaders chose coherence over clarity at a moment when coherence felt essential. They preserved a story that made sense to those who needed it most. But history does not forget what is set aside. It waits. The question once buried became a lens through which later wars could be re-examined. Not to assign blame, but to recognize pattern. Prolonged conflicts, sudden endings, misjudged endurance, repeated surprise at the moment collapse finally comes. Each time the same lesson hovers nearby. Force matters. Resources matter. But understanding when belief breaks matters more. The sealed question was not about Germany. It was about war itself, about the invisible line between endurance and collapse, about how leaders interpret resistance and how misinterpretation extends suffering, even when outcomes are no longer in doubt. By the time this understanding became acceptable, the moment to apply it had passed for the war that inspired it. That is often how insight works. It arrives just late enough to be remembered, but too late to be used. And that may be the most enduring lesson of all. It ended where it began. Not on a battlefield, but in a quiet building where history briefly slowed down. The intelligence office looked ordinary in daylight. Desks cleared, files stacked, windows open just enough to let the sound of a rebuilding city drift inside. Nothing about the room suggested that a decision made there had shaped how an entire war would be remembered. The folder was still locked away. By then, the men who had handled it had moved on, some to new commands, some to retirement, some into history themselves. What remained was not the question, but the choice made around it. A choice to move forward without fully integrating what had been seen. That choice did not change the outcome of the war. It changed its meaning. World War II became a story of momentum, scale, and inevitability. It was taught as proof that superior systems properly applied would always prevail. This story was not false. It was simply incomplete. And incompleteness, when repeated enough times, hardens into doctrine. The sealed question represented a different truth. One that suggested wars are not ended by pressure alone, but by timing. That force succeeds fastest when it coincides with internal collapse. That victory is less about how much power is applied and more about when understanding arrives. Understanding arrived late that night, late enough that acting on it would have disrupted certainty, late enough that acknowledging it would have complicated the ending, late enough that silence felt safer than clarity. So history moved forward without it. This is not a story about cowardice or conspiracy. It is a story about speed, about how quickly leaders must decide, and how rarely insight arrives early enough to be comfortably used. Wars move faster than understanding. Institutions move slower than truth. The gap between them is where decisions like this are made. The most consequential moments are often the quietest. The question itself no longer matters. Its exact wording has been lost to time. What matters is what it revealed. That the enemy was not simply collapsing under weight, but holding together until meaning failed. That the end came suddenly, not gradually. That belief, once broken, ends, wars faster than any weapon. This realization has surfaced again and again since, in conflicts that lasted longer than expected, in collapses that came faster than anyone predicted. Each time analysts rediscovered the same principle, as if it were new. History does not repeat lessons loudly. It repeats them patiently. The sealed folder was not a failure of intelligence. It was a reflection of leadership under pressure. Leaders chose coherence over complexity, closure over uncertainty. A story that could be told cleanly rather than a truth that demanded reflection. That choice is understandable. It is also costly, because when wars are remembered only as victories of force, future wars are planned the same way. Pressure is increased, commitment deepened, and confusion sets in when resistance does not behave as expected. The pattern repeats not because leaders are ignorant, but because earlier understanding was set aside. The final irony is this. The question that was considered too dangerous to record did not weaken victory. It strengthened comprehension. It did not challenge success. It explained it. But explanations that arrive too late rarely change outcomes. They change legacies. If there is a lesson here, it is not about Germany or the Second World War. It is about leadership itself, about the courage not just to act quickly, but to recognize when understanding arrives at the wrong moment and to preserve it anyway. History is shaped not only by what is done, but by what is acknowledged. That night, a question was asked that cut closer to the truth of war than any map or report. It was sealed away, not because it was wrong, but because it arrived when certainty was more valuable than insight. The war ended soon after, but the question never really did.